for the economy, for jobs, and specifically here for the city. My approach to it is a pragmatic one. I'm not a believer in political union in Europe. I don't have any particular sense of European identity. If I was asked to identify with any country outside Britain, it would probably be India. So I'm not approaching this from an ideological standpoint, and I simply believe on pragmatic grounds that it's something we should be doing. Because I'm pragmatic, I pose the question, what is the alternative? I was involved in the debates in the 70s around British original membership. I was a young politician in Scotland, and I was struck by the people who were anti, some of them on one side saying this is a wicked capitalist club, we shouldn't join, and people on the other side saying it isn't enough of a capitalist club. The world has moved on since then, but we have a whole array of alternatives. Some people say we should be more like Norway in the single market but not the Union. Some say we should be more like Switzerland, with a network of treaties, not membership of either. Some people want us to get out altogether. Some people argue from an internationalist free trading alternative, others argue from a nationalistic alternative, stopping the single market, stopping the freedom of movement of labour. We need to be absolutely clear what the counterfactual is, what is the alternative that is being put forward as a single proposition. But let me just make a positive case. In terms of the single market, one of the central issues here is the importance of inward investment in the UK. We're the third largest recipient of inward investment in the world. Much of it comes here on the very clear premise that those companies have access to the European single market. One of our big success stories is the power industry. We've got 750,000 people directly employed or in the supply chain. Most of those are foreign-owned companies that invest here because there is no tariff between ourselves and the European Union, and because there is a single market and they rely on selling into. And some of them have made it abundantly clear, and indeed the Japanese government made it abundantly clear, that they would reconsider their position if we were not part of it. It applies also to the city. There is a survey that you will no doubt hear more of. I think 60% of the decision makers in the city have said that they are here because they know they have access to the single market and a role in formulating the rules on financial services. And they would not be here otherwise. And we know, on the other hand, in Switzerland, which doesn't have access to the rules of the single market, there is now an exodus taking place here as a consequence of that lack of clarity. In terms of our relationship with the rest of the world, a key point that we have to factor into our long-term view is that much of the growth is happening outside of the European Union. China, India, Russia, Brazil, Turkey, the rest of them. We have to engage with that. I think the critics of the European Union have to explain how we would do better in addressing those opportunities outside rather than inside. Why would the Chinese, the Indians and the rest of them want to give preference, whether it's in terms of negotiating a trade agreement or in particular contractual issues, to a country which is 1/10 the size of the European Union? Why is it that we underperform in those markets? If we wanted to look at role models, we'd be looking at countries like Germany, far outseen our performance in those emerging markets, and they do it from within the European Union. Nobody has ever explained to me how exiting makes it easier to trade and invest in those economies. Now, there are costs associated with membership, of course there are. There are regulatory costs. I deal a great deal with small, medium-sized companies who are concerned about regulation, though actually it's probably not the most important of their concern. But let's ask the question about regulation. Do we need to leave the European Union single market in order to deal with the concerns of SMEs? Many of their biggest concerns, the regulatory burdens on British business, are about things we impose here, nothing to do with the European Union. Things to do with the complexity of the tax system, the visa regime, maybe even the minimum wage regulation. Nothing to do with the European Union. People complain that we go late. In other words, the British are even more committed to regulation than the rest of the Union. And how would we avoid many of these regulations? By leaving. You know, the Norwegians have already accepted in full the regulatory framework of the single market, but have no say in it. So what other options do we have? And of course we can improve things. I frequently chair meetings within the European Union involving fellow European ministers who want to reform. 18, 20 countries want to liberalise the system, want to simplify regulation, get rid of it, exempt micro companies from complex regulation. One final point, uncertainty. There is massive uncertainty in the business environment. Out of the crisis, problems around Scotland. Do we want to make that problem of uncertainty worse by reopening one of the most fundamental aspects of our trade and investment relationship? I think the answer is no. Thank you.